They told you disappointment comes from expecting too much, but they were wrong. I learned that the hard way through my own marriage. I didn't expect perfection. I just naively believed marriage would grow us up, that stepping into the real world would call someone forward in my husband the way it had in me. But instead of rising, he regressed, and I found myself lowering the bar again and again. Over time, my husband did less and less participation, less effort, and fewer basic adult responsibilities, and I found myself adjusting. I became more of a caretaker, more of a manager, and eventually more of a servant. I didn't call it codependency then, but that's exactly what it was. While I was taking on more, he was investing less, not just in our relationship, but in himself. And to survive the dynamic, I kept lowering my expectations, telling myself that a little was better than nothing, that if I just expected less, I wouldn't be so disappointed. But what I was really doing was lowering my standards. That pattern repeated with the next man I dated after divorce. My boyfriend started out sweet, quiet, easygoing. He offered to help, stepped in gently, and made it easier for me to receive, something that had always been hard for me. And I thanked him for every little thing he did. I was so used to doing everything alone that when he did even the smallest thing, I thanked him like he moved mountains. Because compared to my marriage, it was a mountain. He was the one who told me to stop thanking him for everything. He said, "You need to raise your expectations." And the irony? To avoid disappointment, I ended up having to lower them for him too, just like I did in my marriage. Eventually, even after I kept adjusting, kept lowering the bar, he still said my expectations were too high. And that's the part that stings. Because when you've been bending and shrinking and softening, and someone still says you're asking for too much, it makes you question your sanity. But the truth is, people say that all the time. Your expectations are too high, and we believe them because we've been trained to. Have you ever heard that quote, "Expectation is the root of all heartache"? Not only is it misattributed to Shakespeare, but it's also bad advice. That's the irony. Two wrongs, and we still treat it like wisdom. We're told that if we didn't expect so much, we wouldn't get hurt. But that's not the problem. The problem is who we place our expectations on, and how often we fail to speak our standards out loud. So here's the thing. We confuse expectations and standards. When we expect someone to live up to our standards, we're placing expectations on someone who may not share them. That's when expectations are too high, not because the standard is wrong, but because their character doesn't align with it. But our expectations of ourselves, that's where standards live. Everyone is capable of having good character. Everyone is capable of respect and consideration. Standards are what we hold ourselves to. Expectations are what we assume others will do. When we lower our standards for the people we let in, we surround ourselves with less than we deserve. And when we expect others to meet us at those standards, that only works if they already live there. Expectations and standards are not mutually exclusive, but they're not the same. And here's the other piece we mix up: spoken expectations and unspoken standards. If I have a standard of starting things on time and I expect others to do the same, I have to say that. I have to hold them to it, and I have to model it. If I never say it, but I still expect it, and then they don't meet it, that's my fault. That's when resentment builds. That's when people say your expectations are too high. But really, you just never spoke your standards. Now, going back to my boyfriend, he always gave me the impression that he didn't really want me in his life. He was vague, he hid me, he never invited me to his place. It was always me inviting myself, and every time I felt like I was overstepping. I barely met his family, never met his friends, and he kept me at a distance from his son, who looked at me like a stranger even after years. If I was going to be in his world, I had to insert myself. And yes, I asked him to invite me. I asked him to want me there. But he brushed it off, always making it about my kids, saying it was easier for him to come to me because I was a single mom that had kids full time. But the truth was, he couldn't receive. He couldn't take in what he wanted or even say it out loud. He expected me to just know, to read his mind, to give him what he couldn't ask for. And when I didn't, he resented me. After we broke up, he let it slip that he held it against me that I hardly ever visited. I was aghast because I had wanted to, desperately. But he never said he wanted me there. He made me feel like an intrusion, so I had stopped offering. That's when expectations become toxic, when they're unspoken, unclear, and weaponized after the fact. You didn't know, but somehow you're still to blame. Expectations are unspoken wants, assumed agreements, and unmet projections. When someone says they'll go to counseling or follow through on something, and they don't, that's when you realize you expected them to have a standard they never had. You believed they would follow through because you would. But that was false projection, a hopeful one, and it led to disappointment. The day I was coached on that was a breakthrough. But I didn't ask him to go to counseling, I said. He's the one who came to me and volunteered. And my coach reflected back, you expected him to keep his promise. Yes, I did. Expecting him to keep his promise was too high of an expectation, he stated back to me. It wasn't that my standard was too high. It was that I had too high of an expectation for that man. Having standards isn't wrong. Expecting integrity, follow through, and emotional presence isn't too much. But expecting someone to live up to those standards when they've never shown they can, or worse, when you've never said what your standards even are, that will only lead to pain. You don't have to lower your expectations. You can invite your partner to raise theirs, to meet you in a space of shared responsibility, mutual respect, and emotional maturity. If they won't or can't, then you get to decide, do I want to lower my standards or do I rise alone? Keep your standards high, live them out loud, and surround yourself with people who already live there. That's not asking for too much. That's how you raise your life. If any of my story sounds like yours, you're not alone. You're not too much, and you're not imagining it. You've just been adjusting to a version of love that asked too much of you and too little of them. If you're ready to stop shrinking yourself to fit someone else's limits, if you're done lowering your standards just to keep the peace, I want to personally invite you to join my women's group coaching circle, Beyond the Butterflies. This is where we do the real work. The work of reclaiming your standards, using your voice, and surrounding yourself with relationships that match your growth. Come find the women who are walking this path with you. The link is in the notes below.